Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of The Flash. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, obviously we're picking up after the events of the last episode. Obviously, now all the Wells that they've ever known, whether it's the individual Wells they've met over the years, or whether it's the Council of Wells, they're gone, so now it's up to them to handle everything. And obviously, I think this is our first time ever seeing that chamber of theirs, which is like to represent everyone that they've ever lost, which is interesting because, especially because Cisco talks about it basically being ingrained in a way that, like, no matter how much the timeline changes, the losses that they've suffered, who they've lost, will never change. They will never disappear from our memories, because that's the sad thing of, like, because of the way the timeline has a tendency to change on them all the time, so much is always different, but it's like this is to never forget all the people we've lost along the way. But obviously it's a reminder for Joe to tell Barry it's okay, because obviously it's like what Wells taught us is that each one of them has taught us our greatest strength isn't our superpowers, it's our humanity. But for Barry, he feels like a lot of times that heart of his, which has always been his most redeeming quality, has always been the best part of him. I mean, obviously that's why Oliver was willing to sacrifice himself for Barry and Kara, because of who they are, them being the symbols of hope that they are because of their big hearts. But for Barry, and currently it's like, hey, I feel like my heart's my greatest weakness because it's used against me time and time and time again. But obviously because of, at first I was wondering, because at first we see that Barry's able to kind of like calculate stuff at like a very high speed level, and obviously Cisco calls it like obviously super fast, super speed thinking or whatever. And I'm like, at first I was thinking like, oh, could this be a byproduct of all the Wells coming into him? So like all their knowledge kind of becomes his. So I thought that might have been like, because we had brought it up last episode, like every time he's running, it's like the Wells are with him. So I thought it'd be interesting in certain regards if like that ended up being the case. But what I thought was really fascinating is actually, no, this is a byproduct of the artificial speed force and unlocked a new power within him. Which at first I was like, oh, didn't he already technically have this? And I guess not really. His whole thing was obviously he could, use his speed to like read, and I think he can process what information he's gaining at super fast speed, sure, but like thinking on such a quick, fast level, because even if he were to freeze time, he's still thinking on a normal level. This like supercharges his brain so that he's like thinking like faster than like even the smartest computers. And so he's able to kind of figure out how they operate things. This episode actually went in directions I wasn't even expecting it to go, because I thought like, for Cisco, he was kind of beating himself up for not kind of seeing like what was kind of in front of him, like not being able to figure out the issues of opening up the Mirrorverse. I thought this was going to be a thing of like, oh, Barry's so smart now. My thing was kind of being the smart guy on the team, and if Barry doesn't need me, then I thought that's like the direction that was going to go, but it ended up not being the direction at all. I thought that was kind of fascinating. Obviously we're tying in the whole thing with it's not just Barry and them that are suffering because of the loss of not just only Nash but all the other Wells, but obviously this hit Allegra hard. And I thought it was interesting the conversation she had with Cecile, because for Allegra, she opens up about the reason why she never got really close to Nash is because for her dad abandoned her when she's like, I was barely able to walk when my dad left. And for her, like, her defense mechanism is to basically cut any father figure out of her life before they have a chance to cut her out of their lives. So it's always, it's just kind of like, oh, like, I'll just, just so I don't end up getting hurt later on down the road, I'm going to stop this right here and there. And because of that, she never got close to Nash and never got to know him. And because of that, he's gone now and there's no getting him back. But Cecile talks about the fact is just because someone's gone doesn't mean they have to be completely gone. She talked about like obviously like she carries the torch of her grandfather and her mother, like her grandfather's like files she keeps, and also like her mom's briefcase, and it's like I carry them with me all the time. It's like the people we've loved are only gone when we let go of them, because I mean, and to me, that's always a beautiful sentiment of remembering, like, someone is always going to be alive as long as there's someone to remember them. As long as you live in someone else's memories, and as long as those memories get passed on, like, that person never truly dies. I always say that's kind of a beautiful sentiment. And so, obviously, Allegra ends up getting a message from Iris. Like, her message was meant to be sent to just Camilla and Sing, but I guess because of the way her brain is operating now in the Mirrorverse, it ended up kind of working to their advantage. And they didn't really explain like how that worked, but I guess because Iris ended up touching the computer at the time, and I guess it kind of like she has some kind of control over the mirror world. So I think in that moment when she touched the screen, the image, the message got flipped and brought into the non-mirror world. But obviously, Barry has kind of figured out how they operate this whole thing. Really quickly, I did like that whole display with the whole like quantum ball patent pending, and just how that whole thing operated. It was actually pretty badass. And him turning around, knowing exactly where it hit. He had his hand ready the entire time, telling them to duck and everything. But when the time came, it's like they ended up figuring out what they needed. Wasn't Ramsey's blood, but basically the particles that stuck to Eva when she came out. So they're still around her, so all they have to do is gather those up and they'll be able to make their way. Obviously Cisco's like, man, I couldn't figure this out. I didn't see it. And it's like, it's okay. Barry's like, Ava, kind of deceived us, using my heart against me, and she'll be the last one. So when the time came, he suited up as a Flash, brought in Frost, which I thought was interesting because she came as Frost, and no point did she necessarily come back out as Caitlin. I don't know, not unless they're in like a hybrid mode right now, because they never really went into. I'm assuming she's Frost mode right now, so that must mean like Caitlin's kind of sitting on a back burner, but she never switched over to being Caitlin, so like that's why I don't know whether like something happened in between there where they are more hybrid right now, or whether I think that was just full blown Frost, but nevertheless. It was pretty badass, like, her stalling Ava enough time for Barry to gather up all the particles around her, because it's like, well, he needs Ava distracted because on her own, Ava is faster than him. But when the time came, Barry let Frost get hit, and that's the messed up thing, because later on he talks about, he's like, oh, there was like a 0.0002% chance that the tachyon device would have gotten hurt, and it's like, damn, it's just like, but it's a less than 1%, but in his logical mind, it's like, no, I couldn't take that chance. And also, it's like, oh, here's something to help Caitlin. It's like, well, have you tested it out? It's like, oh, I've run simulations in my head, like over 2,000 tests in my head. It's like, wait, and he goes along with it. And he's like, I let you get hit because I knew I could help you. And it's like, okay, showing you, obviously, Barry, who wanted to stop thinking so much with his heart and feeling with his heart because he feels like his heart's kind of used. Because obviously, it's a situation where like his heart has kind of led to him doing things in the past that's kind of screwed up in the past, and obviously more recently, it's kind of screwed him over, at least in his eyes. So for him to be in this situation where he's very robotic and just thinking from a logical standpoint, obviously, there's a lot of issues that stem from that. I just thought that was kind of, it's like, oh, just when Barry wants to stop, having his heart be his weakness, now he's just full blown thinking with his mind and not feeling or thinking with his heart, which is obviously super bad. It actually kind of makes me feel like Barry kind of became a little bit like the thinker in this point in time, where it's just kind of like no one else matters, like all that matters is kind of my mission, and he thinks, like I said, purely logically and not thinking from an emotional level. So it's like, it's ironically, I think he ended up becoming a lot more like the thinker in this regard. And obviously Cisco and Caitlin could kind of see through, like, yeah, something's not right with Barry, just the way he's acting, like he's even later on being like, oh, we'll rescue the targets. You mean our friends? It's one and the same. It's like, like no emotions. He's devoid of it. He's just thinking from a purely logical standpoint, especially when it comes to the whole Eva situation. To basically get her distracted, he basically blasts her on television and kind of admitting, like, whoa, showing the video of like, whoa, did you kill the real Ava McCulloch? Like, who are you really? What are you? She's like, no. Like, once again, Snow is like, Frost is like, should you really have done that? She was super unstable to begin with, and now you've sent her spiraling even more. But it's like, yeah, but now that she got distracted, she's, going to make mistakes, and now she won't see us when we're trying to, like, break into the Mirrorverse. So, granted, that obviously we'll get to that later on about, like, the whole Eva thing, which is actually kind of sad, because obviously she was in a state of, God, what was that? She's basically in the middle of an existential crisis, and she's kind of bottling it out because, like, it's like, oh, your husband Joseph kept stuff from us, and she's like, no, I promise I won't lie to you. It's like, to be fair, it's not the biggest deal hiding the fact is that she's not really the Eva McCulloch that she's actually a reflection from the Mirrorverse that the real Ava's dead. Is that really that big of a deal? Especially considering all the plans you have. But I guess it's like, oh, we've been following. I guess it's just like, well, it's like you lying about anything at all is just more, lies, from Joseph. It's interesting too what Barry was able to kind of pick this up, because it's like, because when Ava went to go get the rest of her technology, she was saying like, oh, I'm more than a phantom, aren't I, Joseph? And using that and kind of looking at a lot of her body language and her writing, Barry kind of recognized probably like there's actually kind of inverse. It's probably a thing of like, hey, maybe like naturally Ava's a lefty, but obviously maybe now she's a righty. Maybe I think it's probably stuff like that, but just like her body language, like where she might have normally leaned to the left, and maybe when she's sitting now she's doing the opposite and leaning to the right. Probably they didn't really get into the nitty gritty, but they kind of reference, like it seems like it might be stuff of that nature that made Barry kind of piece it all together. And then he ended up hacking into McCulloch Tech's stuff, which even like Cisco was like, I've been trying for hours, and you were able to just do it. It's like, oh yeah, his brain, he's getting smarter with his super thinking is getting bigger and better. So it was an interesting turn of events. And then we get a little bit of it. We get more of it in the episode, but it actually, if you've ever seen the movie Next with Nicolas Cage, it kind of reminds me of that, where basically he could see 2 minutes into the future. That's kind of like the whole premise behind the movie. I thought it was actually kind of fascinating. It actually kind of it's adopted quite a few elements from the movie Next and kind of applied it in this, especially because he's talking to Gideon, and it's like, all right, but because of the situations of people being inside of the Mirrorverse longer than others, that being Iris being in there longer than Camilla and Singh, it led to basically the what they were able to get from Ava is only enough to save Singh and Camilla or save Iris, because saving Iris would mean using all that they have. Camilla and Singh haven't been in there long enough, so they could save both of them. So it becomes a choice. And when the time comes, Barry, using his thinking, kind of figures out like how the whole situation was going to play out. And when it came down to it, they voted to, like, instead of saving Iris, everyone voted to save Singh and Camilla, and Barry was like, you know what? No, I can't rely on them. I already know how this is going. I have to save Iris. Now, what was really interesting, because at first you're like, is he actually just going to save Iris because he cares about her? Like, it doesn't seem like you're emotionally invested. Oh, because it turns out, no, Iris, I need to save her because it's the logical choice, because she knows more about Ava, so she's saving her is just tactical. There's no emotion like, oh, that's my wife. It's like, no, this is me purely being tactical. Obviously, Cisco being upset when he finds out, wait, you didn't even like have this conversation with us. It's like, no, I worked out. I saw exactly how you guys were going to vote. You were going to vote to save Camilla and Singh. But for him, it's like, no, we wouldn't. Like, the thing is, you want to try to predict everything, but the one thing you can't predict is emotions, because that's the most unpredictable aspect of human. Yeah, you can predict behavior and stuff like that. Like, there's a good chance that someone might react a certain way, sure, but like emotions aren't that predictable. They're the hardest part of the human condition. It's the hardest aspect to define, to kind of calculate. And if Kingdom Hearts has taught me anything, it's that the heart is incalculable. And that's the thing. Like, Barry was coming at those situations from a place of non-emotion. Like, you're in a place where you're not having emotion, so why you're kind of evaluating this from a place of non-emotion as well. Because I think for him, it's like he never really brought, like, even in that, they're just kind of voting for it. It's like, they would never vote for that. They would like, no. They even said it, says like, can we find another way? But Barry's like, no, there's one way. Even then, they would never choose. They were like, no, we will find another way. We've always found another way. Like, despite the odds being stacked against us, everything saying that it's all going to be this one way, we always found another way. That's what Team Flash does best. But obviously Barry's not in his right state of mind. Because it was interesting how Cisco explained it too, that basically because Eobard uses the negative negative emotions as kind of essentially the foundation for his Speed Force, and to counteract that, they didn't want to do that same thing, so they made sure that the artificial Speed Force would not have an impact on Barry emotionally, and it kind of had the opposite effect of, it made him smarter in his brain thinking overdrive, but it made it so that his emotions are deteriorating. Like, the best quality about him is disappearing. And so, obviously, Barry's saying, like, Camilla was expendable, so obviously that set Cisco off. So all three of them are working together, which I also thought was pretty dope. That you had Allegra showing up. They don't make too much note of it, but obviously she's wearing Nash's jacket and like his adventuring sash or belt slash thing. So I thought that was pretty dope. And them working together to go up against Barry, and it's like, yeah, Barry might be faster than them, but obviously they're working as a team. And I even love like Frost putting in velocity 10. I'm like, dude, having Frost abilities and super speed at the same time, it's pretty damn sick. You know, but I also love what Cisco said, like, yeah, the Babel protocol, it's not just, you know, force fields and tech. It's us playing our role, like us working together as a team is also how this whole thing operates. So, but Barry, like, getting the win in the long run by being like, you lost the beginning and you didn't even know it. And then it's like the ball bounces back, sets off a chain of things, and it knocks them out. I was almost hoping, like, okay, Barry's thinking about this. Like I said, this is going to be kind of spoilers for the movie next. The movie's from a couple years ago. Basically, at the end of the movie, spoilers if you don't want to know, it basically ends up being that most of the movie is him stretching that 2 minutes further. So basically, the entire movie's kind of like, not necessarily a dream sequence, but a sequence of how things could have played out. That ends up being kind of the twist of the movie. I was halfway expecting there to be a twist to this episode with everything that goes down. I'm going to go ahead and say it. To me, that makes this episode kind of a bummer in the sense of like, man, it's depressing that all that went down, because I was almost hoping that Barry like was just thinking this far in advance, and it turns out him being like, oh no, I have to stop this before it goes too far. No, it kept going, because on the other side, Iris ends up meeting up with Camilla. They got to try and find Singh. Obviously, she's like, I think I'm getting more control of this place. I can figure some stuff out. But by the time they meet up, Iris is the only one that was brought into the mirror world by Ava dragging her in. Camilla and Singh were brought in here by the mirror gun, so it's having a different adverse reaction to them, to the point it's killing them. And when the time comes, Barry ends up releasing, opening the Mirrorverse, which Iris is like, oh my god, Barry! But it's like, yeah, you got to come through. You know what's going on with Ava. And for Iris, it's like, Barry, something's not right. You want me to leave Camilla and Singh? I told you they're dying. It's like, no, we had to find. But obviously, he's forcing her by activating the device to try and drag her through. And it seemed like she was kind of, I think, trying to use her mirror powers to fight it back. So I was like, okay, I thought what was going to happen was she was going to somehow use her mirror powers to throw Singh and Camilla through. The real twist that she ended up getting pulled through herself. I was like, oh, and the portal closed. I'm like, oh, there's no more of that matter from Ava to go through that again. I was like, oh, wait. That's why I was like, even at those points, I was like, no, we're going to get revealed that this whole thing is still Barry thinking that far in advance. And it's like, nope. And then obviously Iris kind of starts having, because he didn't account for her being like, because he was even saying like, oh, Iris would agree with my decision. It's like, no, she wouldn't. Like, Iris would be self-sacrificing. It's like, okay, if you can save two of our friends in the process, two people we care about in the process, then I'll stay behind, because she's in a better situation than them, in her opinion. Because it's like, I might have been here longer, but it makes more sense for me to stay here than anyone else, because I'd rather sacrifice myself than be saved. So obviously for him, it's like, well, that's not what I predicted. You know, once again, you can't predict emotions, you can't predict people, and obviously he didn't account or know about. Because I think the rules of that world aren't in something that he can necessarily figure out, because that world works different on different rules. So he doesn't know, like, wait, Iris, because she was there so long, she started to change, and now, like, she's not adjusted to this world, and we see her kind of having, like, almost like a seizure of some sort. And obviously, in that moment, it snapped Barry out of it. In that moment, his heart came back. And he looks at what he's done. He's like, no. He sees what happened to Iris. And in that moment, he destroys the artificial speed force. And we see, like, at first, with the lightning going through him, I was like, oh, is he about to explode or something? And then I was like, and we're going to find out he was thinking too far ahead. Nope. That was just his speed disappearing again. I was like, wow, that's also interesting. He got his speed back for one episode. Because I also, like, they're going to have which is sad at the end of the day too, because you think about it, it's like that means what the whales did. It's like they sacrificed themselves. Granted, I think there's still some part of Barry, but it's like he had to destroy the artificial speed force. Like I was wondering, like, do you go back in time? Like, how do you handle this? I mean, he can't go back in time. He doesn't have his speed anymore, and Iris is in the situation she's in. The team is in the situation they're in. Barry doesn't have his speed anymore. Sing and Camilla are dying on the other side. It's like everything that could go wrong is literally going wrong. At the same time, like I said, we had Ava having a nervous breakdown because for her, it's like, I'm not a monster. I'm not, because obviously a lot of her own thoughts and kind of what Joseph said before kind of weighing on her. Like, it's like, oh, I'm not even really Ava. It's like, this world isn't mine, but it could be. So I think for her, it's like, I'm done, if I'm not the real Ava, so what? I can make this world mine. So I think what she's going to do is replace everyone in that world with mirror images, and that way she won't feel like, oh, this isn't my world anymore. I've made it my world. All the people that have been replaced. So now it is my world. Now I won't feel like such a monster because everyone in this world is like me. It's like a twisted way to kind of deal with your existential crisis. Once again, the irony behind it, you struggle so much to get back to this world blaming Joseph for your death, and it was like, oh, you're dead. I mean, for blaming Joseph for you ending up in the mirror because he didn't save you, but it's like, oh yeah, because you were never his real wife. His real wife died during the particle accelerator 6 years ago, so it's just the tragic irony behind it. So there's all of that. Once again, this whole situation being the tragic situation that it is, like I said, it ends off on a bit of a bummer. And then we had the whole situation with I thought was kind of fascinating, where it was like, okay, and we go back to when Eobard replaced this Earth One's whales. And so when that's all said and done, like obviously we see Eobard put his body in a grave, but then when like something happens, I don't know whether that was a byproduct. That might have been like a crisis thing where when Oliver restored Earth 1 and made it Earth Prime, like maybe upon doing that he restored Wells, which I guess that means like this Harrison Wells has been kind of out and about doing his thing since Crisis got averted, so he's been there hiding out the entire time, I guess. Maybe because that's it. Because I was about to say, well, it makes sense because Nash was a part of all this. He was already kind of on Earth 1, even though his Earth was already kind of gone. So I guess I think that's what that's supposed to be. I think that was, Oliver setting a lot of stuff right, and I think that's my only explanation for that, like why that was. I'm assuming that's supposed to be like, and he got brought back to life because this world's timeline changed. So it begs the question, where has this Wells been the entire time? I mean, once again, there's still a lot of this world's history we don't know. That we know some bits of obviously how much it's changed because of Crisis, but that's fascinating. So, which is interesting because we get a Wells that we've never gotten before, the OG Wells from this world, because obviously we had Eobard pretending to be him, so it's going to be interesting to meet the real him. Is he going to be a lot like the Eobard that was pretending to be him? To be fair, that was years ago, so which feels like an eternity ago, like when we had Eobard pretending to be. So obviously he had his own machinations, he was up to his own plans and everything, so it's going to be interesting to meet the real Wells from this world and how much has kind of changed on that front. So I was actually surprised about that. It's like, oh, so I guess currently speaking he might be the only Wells that's left in the multiverse, depending on how things kind of build out, because who knows, maybe going forward when the multiverse builds back out, you'd assume that the Wells would kind of replenish the multiverse in some shape or form. Now, whether it's the Wells they knew, different versions of those Wells, like whether they're kind of plopped from their ethereal situation and placed back on their respective Earths once the multiverse builds back out, or like I said, they died, but some new version of them exists as the multiverse splits back out again. Who knows? That's where my thought process is on it, but that's interesting. Interesting circumstances to have for episode 2. To be fair, this would technically be episode 21 of season 2, but still it's of season 6, sorry. But it's still quite fascinating, even accounting that, it's still kind of crazy to think of this as like episode 2 of the season, because that's like a wow. I'm so curious to see where this goes. I guess Wells might be, I mean, considering he's the one that built the original particle accelerator, he might be the one that can actually help Barry with his current circumstances, so maybe that's why they're also setting that up now too. So it's like, I can only assume, but I'm curious to see how this is all going to work out. You hope that's going to work out for the best. Considering where things are right now, doesn't seem like that's likely, because things kind of seem like they're falling apart and wrong on every facet and corner of this situation. But we'll ultimately have to wait and see where all of this ultimately ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.